I remember the exact moment everything changed, though at the time it felt like a dream sequence in slow motion. It was late afternoon on a Tuesday, a day that should have been indistinguishable from any other, but it wasn't. The sun was drifting behind the clouds, painting the living room a shade of gray, reminiscent of my mood during those months of depression I was wading through. I was sitting on the couch, swirling lukewarm tea in a cheap mug, wishing I could muster the will to pour it down the drain and get on with my day. That's when my wife, Anna, told me, almost casually, she'd been sleeping with other men. There was an eerie calm in her voice, as if she were discussing the weather. The words landed like a slap, yet I couldn't process them. I had suspected things were off for a while, but I'd been too lost in my own emotional fog to follow through on my suspicions. She was standing by the window, arms folded, wearing that old sweater I once found adorable. Now it only seemed to accentuate how detached she'd become. Her eyes drifted over our yard, and she let out a sigh before turning to me with a frown that I interpreted as self-pity. A wave of conflicting thoughts flooded my head: self-blame, heartbreak, confusion, and, somehow, relief. My world was spinning, but some detached corner of my mind told me I was no longer imagining things. This was real. "You haven't been yourself," she said, like she was explaining why she'd forgotten to buy groceries. "I tried to be there for you, but your depression was too much." I stared, feeling the fabric of the couch pressing into my back. I'd spent countless hours in that very spot, wrestling with dark moods, telling myself to hang on because Anna was my anchor. Hearing her words, I realized she had never been an anchor at all. She was the balloon that had slipped from my grasp, drifting wherever the wind took her, leaving me behind with no warning. My chest tightened, but instead of tears, I felt a coldness rising, a sense of clarity that was painfully overdue. "So you slept with other men because I was depressed," I said. My voice was hoarse, my hands trembled. I set down the mug so it wouldn't shatter. "And you're telling me this now?" She shrugged, a minimal gesture that made me want to laugh at its absurdity. "You shut me out. I had needs. You weren't there for me emotionally, so what was I supposed to do?" I could almost see the gears turning in her mind, seeking validation or hoping for a quick fix. Maybe she thought my depression was an all-purpose excuse that would let her walk away guilt-free. But I didn't have the energy to yell or demand details. I simply nodded, got up from the couch, and told her I needed time to think. She opened her mouth as if to argue, then closed it. Maybe even she recognized that I was too numb for a shouting match. I spent the next few days in a state of quiet shock, drifting through my job at the local newspaper, doing the bare minimum so I wouldn't get fired. My editor, Tom, asked if everything was okay. I managed a half smile and lied about having insomnia. It wasn't entirely untrue. I was awake most nights anyway, staring at the ceiling, feeling betrayal's bitter taste. My depression was already a heavy weight, but discovering her affairs made it 10 times worse. I doubted everything: my worth, my sense of reality, my entire marriage. I tried to recall exactly when our relationship had begun to sour. We'd married young, she was 22 and I was 24. For a while, we were happy. I remembered road trips and quiet nights watching old movies, and I recalled the day we bought this house, painting the living room walls a pale blue together. But somewhere along the line, something changed. Life had piled on stress, job pressures, money woes, the creeping sense that we were drifting apart. While I sank into despair, she apparently found comfort in other men's arms. The realization made my stomach churn with a slow-burning fury. At first, I wrestled with the idea that maybe I'd driven her to it. In my darkest moments, I wondered if my depression was too great a burden. But then, I remembered that in a marriage, you're supposed to stand by your partner, not run off and betray them. I had never lifted a hand to her. I'd never turned emotionally abusive. I'd just been sad, a heavy, soul-draining sadness, but still, sadness. The more I examined it, the more I realized her betrayal went beyond a simple mistake. She'd made a choice. Multiple times, apparently, with multiple guys. The question was, who were these other men, and how long had this been going on? But to my own surprise, I discovered I wasn't even that curious. Learning specifics would only deepen the wound. All that mattered was that she had betrayed me, and she had the gall to blame me for it. A few nights after her confession, she approached me in the kitchen while I was making a sandwich, my first proper meal of the day. I'd been living off junk, too depressed to cook anything substantial. She leaned against the counter, looking exhausted. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I know it's a lot to handle." I found that almost laughable, an apology accompanied by zero remorse in her voice. She was sorry for the inconvenience, but not the act. "Yeah," I muttered, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's a lot." She shifted her weight, fiddling with a loose thread on her sweater. "It just happened. I never set out to hurt you." When I didn't respond, she continued, "I still care about you, but we can't keep living like this. Maybe it's best we end things. It's not healthy for either of us." There it was, the quiet push toward divorce, delivered as if she was reading lines off some script. We had been drifting, yes, but that statement lit a spark of anger in me. I was dealing with a mental health crisis, and her solution was to cheat and then leave. Worse, she wanted me to believe it was my fault, as though my sadness had driven her into other men's beds. I stared at her, 1,000 replies tumbling through my mind, but I couldn't form a coherent sentence. Finally, I just nodded and closed the fridge door. I didn't sleep well that night. While she dozed in the guest room, she'd moved there to avoid awkwardness. I sat in bed plotting how to handle this. Divorce was messy, especially when it came to finances. I'd put so much of myself into this house, our joint accounts, everything. The rational side of me said, let it go, move on and rebuild your life. But there was another side, wounded and raw, that craved retribution. I was tired of being the victim. Deep down, I knew I wanted revenge. And not just a fleeting moment of satisfaction, I wanted her to feel what it was like to lose everything. The next morning, I drove to work like a zombie and tried to go about my day as if it were normal. On my lunch break, I began doing research, quietly, methodically. I read about divorce laws in our state, about how cheating could sometimes affect the settlement. I read about spousal support, contested divorces, and property division. Each article I consumed felt like a stepping stone across a raging river, carrying me closer to a shore where I was no longer helpless. By the time I clocked out, I had gathered a load of information, enough to see that if I played my cards right, I could make sure she walked away with next to nothing. I knew that I needed proof of her infidelity. A mere admission in the living room might not suffice in court. The next few days, as tension simmered in our household, I quietly compiled texts, emails, and bank statements. Anna had been sloppy. She'd used our joint bank account to fund dinners at fancy restaurants I had never visited. She'd sent suggestive messages to one of her flings from our home computer, forgetting to delete them from the outbox. It was all there, waiting for me to discover. Each new piece of evidence felt like a knife twisting in my gut, but it also hardened my resolve. No more self-doubt, no more letting her walk all over me. During those weeks, we drifted in a bizarre limbo. We were still living under the same roof, but we barely spoke. When we did, it was tense and clipped. Sometimes she would mutter apologies. Sometimes she would rail at me about how I was making her feel guilty. Other times, she simply acted like it was none of my business if she went out late. Often, I sat in the living room, hunched over my laptop, while she left for a drive, returning hours later. I didn't bother to question it. Each time she left, I seized the opportunity to continue my investigation, meticulously organizing everything I found. Strangely enough, my depression started to lift, if only slightly. I had a renewed sense of purpose, twisted though it was. I began exercising again, forcing myself out for a jog after work. I even started sleeping a little better. Maybe it was the adrenaline from planning a thorough, calculated blow to someone who had shattered my trust. One night, as I was sorting through some new revelations on my laptop, an old friend, Marcus, called. He was concerned, having heard through mutual acquaintances that Anna and I were having problems. Normally, I would have brushed him off, but I found myself talking for over an hour, revealing the bare bones of what had happened. To my surprise, he didn't try to talk me out of my anger. Instead, he simply listened. "You gonna divorce her?" he finally asked. "Yeah," I replied. "I am. I'm done." "Then do what you have to do," he said, "but be careful. These things get ugly, fast." I thanked him for the advice, still determined to stay on course. If ugly was the price for reclaiming my dignity, I was willing to pay it. Time passed slowly. Anna and I continued our daily charade until, at last, she suggested we contact a divorce lawyer. She did it over dinner, an awkward affair consisting of leftover takeout. She shifted uncomfortably. We should get the process started. I can't live in limbo. I sat back, locking eyes with her. Part of me wanted to say I couldn't stand the sight of her, but I held my tongue. Fine, I said. You pick a date to meet with someone, and I'll come along. Let's do it together so we know exactly where we stand. She seemed relieved I wasn't putting up a fight. Thanks, she mumbled, pushing her carton aside. I had already secured my own attorney, a sharp-witted woman named Denise, who came highly recommended by a coworker. I'd briefed Denise on the entire situation, supplying her with the damning evidence of Anna's multiple affairs. When I told her I intended to ensure Anna got nothing, not even a portion of the house, Denise raised an eyebrow but nodded. It's possible, she said, especially with this proof. It'll hinge on how we frame the narrative. The day we finally sat down in a sterile conference room with Anna's lawyer, the tension was palpable. Anna's lawyer, a man with wire-rimmed glasses, tried to push the narrative that Anna was driven to cheat because I was emotionally unavailable. He spun it as though I'd failed her. My cheeks burned, but I forced myself to stay calm. Denise systematically dismantled his arguments, citing the texts and the hotel receipts. She carefully hinted that Anna had repeatedly violated the sanctity of our marriage. Anna's lawyer tried to object, but the evidence was right there, and the effect was immediate. Anna shrank in her seat, her face reddening. For the first time, I thought I saw something close to genuine shame in her eyes. When we reached the topic of splitting assets, Denise made it clear we were open to negotiations, but that if Anna wanted to press the issue, we'd contest everything in court. In our state, adultery could have serious repercussions on property division, particularly since we had no children. Anna squirmed, exchanging anxious looks with her attorney. The conversation ended with us agreeing to meet again after both parties had time to review the evidence in detail. On the drive home, Anna stared out the passenger window. She looked drained. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. I gripped the steering wheel. "I think you know why." She turned to me, tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean for it to go this far. You just cheated on me while I was depressed," I snapped, my voice firm. "And you blamed it on me. Did you expect me to pay you alimony after all that?" She said nothing, and we completed the ride in silence. After we got home, she locked herself in the guest room and I retreated to the bedroom, my mind buzzing. I knew this was only the first round. In the end, either we'd settle or we'd battle it out in court. She had done real damage, and part of me was still stunned we were even in this situation, but I was determined to see it through, no matter how messy or prolonged it became. I decided to build an even stronger case. I rummaged through old receipts, credit card statements, and any trace of her various flings. I even managed to find a timeline that showed she'd had at least 3 different affairs in the span of 1 year. The darkest part of me wondered how she'd found the time. We'd lived under the same roof, eating breakfast together, acting like a normal couple. It was all so surreal, but the more evidence I found, the less doubt I had. She was not the woman I'd thought I married. Meanwhile, rumors started spreading among our friends. Some took her side, pitying her predicament of having a depressed spouse. Others sided with me, most simply didn't know what to say. I began avoiding social gatherings. I couldn't handle the judging eyes or the well-intentioned concern. Instead, I focused on my job, on exercise, and on my single-minded pursuit of justice in that divorce. One evening, I came home to find Anna in the living room, pacing. She looked anxious, biting her lip. When I closed the door, she turned to face me, tears brimming. "I want to settle," she blurted. "I can't keep going back and forth. Let's just do it quickly." I didn't even blink. "What's your proposal?" She hesitated. "I'll waive alimony, but I want half the equity in the house. We can sell it and split the proceeds." "That's not going to happen," I said calmly. "You can move out. I'm not selling." She scoffed, tears drying as anger took over. "You can't do that to me. I've lived here too." I shrugged. "Yes, you did, but you chose to violate our marriage. I'm willing to negotiate to avoid a lengthy court battle, but that negotiation doesn't include giving you half of everything. You didn't earn it." She glared at me, but I think she already sensed she was cornered. All the evidence we had meant her leverage was practically non-existent. She stormed away, slamming the guest room door so hard the walls shook. I locked myself in my study, pacing until midnight. The anger, once a suffocating presence, was now fueling me. I wouldn't give in, not an inch. If she wanted a fight, she would get it. Over the following weeks, negotiations escalated. Her lawyer tried to bully us into some compromise, suggesting that I was petty and vindictive. Each time, Denise coolly pointed to the evidence of repeated adultery. Eventually, Anna's lawyer realized they were in a losing position. We set a date to finalize the divorce papers. By that point, Anna was barely speaking to me. I was fine with that. My depression, ironically enough, had lessened. I still felt sadness, but it was overshadowed by a grim determination to see this through. On the morning we were scheduled to finalize everything, I woke up feeling oddly calm. It was a crisp autumn day. The leaves in our yard had turned golden brown. I dressed in a simple suit, swallowed a piece of toast, and made my way to the lawyer's office. Anna drove herself in a separate car. Inside that conference room, the atmosphere was tense, but there was an air of conclusion. We signed the papers. She ended up with her personal belongings, her car, and a small settlement that was barely enough to start over. I'd fought tooth and nail to ensure she got as little as possible beyond that, and Denise had come through brilliantly. No alimony, no claim to the house, nothing else. As she penned her signature, Anna refused to look at me, tears dripping onto the stack of legal documents. I watched her hand tremble, and though a distant part of me felt pity, my resolve was stronger. She'd made her choices, now she had to live with them. When the pen's final scratch echoed in the room, it was over. We were no longer married. The lawyers shook hands, and Anna stood up stiffly, refusing to meet my eyes. "I hope you're happy," she said. I remained silent as she walked out. Once she was gone, Denise turned to me with a small nod. "You got what you wanted." "Yeah," I said quietly. "Thank you." I stepped outside, the cool breeze hitting me. A sense of finality weighed on my chest. I realized my life was mine again, to shape however I pleased. That night, I returned to the house, now my house, and sat on the couch in the silent living room. There was no sense of triumph. There was just relief, mingled with the faint echo of betrayal's sting. For a while, I tried to settle back into normalcy. I began therapy for my depression, something I should have done sooner. I told my therapist about the divorce, about the cheating. She said all the usual lines about forgiveness and personal growth, but I cut her short. "I don't forgive her," I told her, "and I don't plan to. I just want to move on." The therapist nodded, scribbling notes, and accepted my stance. Sometimes that was all the validation I needed, that it was okay not to forgive someone who'd broken me in a time of vulnerability. A few months passed. The house felt empty, but also comforting in its quiet. I replaced the furniture in the living room, throwing out the old couch and repainting the walls a neutral cream. My heart still fluttered with a kind of dull ache whenever I recalled the betrayal, but I found ways to cope. I started writing more. I threw myself into reporting assignments, even volunteering for late-night shifts. I reached out to some old friends, reconnecting with a part of myself I'd neglected. One day, I ran into Anna by accident at a local coffee shop. She was sitting alone, staring at her phone with an expression that hinted at stress. I almost walked away, but she glanced up and spotted me. For a moment, we just stared at each other. She looked thinner, and the spark of confidence that once defined her was gone. Part of me wanted to turn around and leave, but I didn't. I had changed. I wasn't the broken man she remembered. She stood, smoothing her coat. "Hi," she murmured. "Hi," I replied. She lowered her gaze. How are you?" I shrugged. "I'm managing." An awkward silence settled, pregnant with things we'd never say. Finally, she said, "I just want you to know, I never hated you. I was just lost." I forced a nod. I wasn't about to comfort her. She'd done more than enough damage. She swallowed hard. "I know I hurt you. I know you hate me now. But for what it's worth, I am sorry." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. There was no desire in me to console her or tell her I understood. Instead, I said, "I hope you find what you're looking for." Then I left, stepping out into the cold day. I felt no sympathy for her struggles. Once upon a time, I might have, but not now. I'd built a fortress around my heart where her memory was concerned. She would never step inside it again. That night, I thought about our encounter. I felt an odd sense of peace. I realized I had no regrets. I had done what I needed to do to reclaim my life, even if part of it had been fueled by bitterness. Some might call it petty, but for me, It was an affirmation of self-worth, an acknowledgement that I deserved better than to be someone's doormat. I think we all have a breaking point, and Anna had pushed me past mine. Life continued, each day a small step forward. I discovered new routines, ventured on solo trips, and found a measure of solace in solitude. My friends noticed I was opening up more, sharing jokes and stories like I used to. Marcus and I started going hiking on weekends, and I embraced the outdoors as a balm for my lingering emotional scars. My therapist, too, noticed the shift. She said I was making progress, that channeling anger into constructive pursuits was healthy as long as I recognized when to let go of the venom. Little did I know I was in for one last twist, a final piece of unpredictability that would remind me life rarely follows neat scripts. One morning, months after the divorce, I was surprised to find a letter in my mailbox. It was from Anna, mailed from a neighboring town. My initial instinct was to tear it up, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened it, hands trembling slightly, and began reading. She wrote that she had been seeing a psychiatrist for several weeks. Her life had spiraled after the divorce. She'd lost friends, crashed on a friend's couch, and was deeply unhappy. She confessed that she'd been trying to understand her own self-destructive behavior. She wrote that she accepted full responsibility for her actions and that she didn't blame me for taking everything. And then, like a sucker punch, she revealed she had been diagnosed with a personality disorder that might have contributed to her impulsive, harmful decisions. She didn't offer this as an excuse, she insisted, but rather as an explanation for why she had sabotaged her own marriage and then tried to shift the blame onto me. She ended by saying she wasn't expecting forgiveness. She just wanted me to know that she'd finally recognized the gravity of what she'd done and that she was determined to work on herself. She wished me happiness and thanked me for the years we'd had together before things fell apart. I stood in my kitchen, letter in hand, absorbing the words. A swirl of emotions took hold: anger, pity, confusion, relief. But through it all, one thought stood out. I still had no intention of forgiving her. She had her reasons, and they might have been tragic, but she'd burned every bridge. My acceptance of her apology would not change the past. And so I folded the letter, tucked it into a drawer, and carried on with my day. For a moment, I considered calling her, telling her I was glad she was seeking help. But then I remembered how I'd felt when she stood in our living room and blamed my depression for her infidelity. I remembered all the nights I'd lain awake, the tears I'd shed, the self-loathing and questions. No, I thought, she could seek her redemption alone. It wasn't my responsibility to give her the closure she needed. In time, the memory of that letter faded. I let other parts of my life take center stage. My work at the paper improved. My editor even promoted me to a senior position. I found new hobbies. I took a photography class and started capturing images of the city's hidden corners. My new sense of purpose, unburdened by a toxic relationship, fueled me. Occasionally, I encountered reminders of Anna. A mutual friend would mention her name in passing, or I'd stumble across an old photograph. Each time, I felt that flicker of pain, but it was weaker than before. I'd made sure she walked away with nothing, and that knowledge, while it might sound cruel, gave me a sense of justice served. I didn't hate her, but I also didn't pity her. She was just a figure in my past, a lesson learned the hard way. Some nights, I stared out my window at the moonlight casting shadows across my yard, recalling how desperately alone I'd felt when my depression was at its worst. But now, there was a faint glow in my chest, telling me I was stronger than before. I had survived betrayal, the messy divorce, the emotional roller coaster, and I was still here, standing on my own 2 feet. I can't say there was some grand epiphany at the end of all this. Life is rarely that neat. But there was a moment, a small one, when I realized I genuinely liked the person I was becoming. I'd been forced out of my comfort zone, forced to fight for my dignity, and in the process, I uncovered a backbone I didn't know I had. Maybe that was the closest thing to a silver lining, learning to respect myself enough to stand up to someone who had trampled my trust. It's been over a year now since the divorce was finalized. My therapist still encourages me to seek closure, but I find that closure doesn't require forgiveness. Sometimes, closure means recognizing something is broken and allowing it to stay that way, refusing to pretend it never happened. I moved forward by focusing on what lies ahead, not by granting absolution to someone who never valued me when it mattered. Last month, I finished renovating the guest room Anna once occupied. I repainted the walls a gentle sage green and replaced the worn carpet with hardwood. Standing there, I remembered the nights she slept in that small space, how we were strangers under the same roof. Now, it's just another room in my home, a place I might turn into an office or a studio for my photography. The ghosts remain in the echoes, but they're quieter now, less threatening. Looking back, I still feel a hint of surprise at the path everything took. If you had asked me years ago how I would handle infidelity, I might have answered with a shrug, claiming I'd forgive and move on because life's too short. But that was before I'd tasted the bitterness of betrayal so intimately. In that moment of deepest hurt, my sense of self-preservation demanded more than just walking away. It demanded justice. Some might call it revenge, and maybe that's accurate, but I see it more as a firm assertion of my own worth. She broke the vows we made, and in so doing, forfeited any right to my mercy. The day our divorce was signed, I stood in that conference room, pen in hand, heart pounding. Part of me doubted if I was doing the right thing by showing no leniency. Yet, when I looked across the table and remembered the months of deception, the lonely nights, and her cold declaration that my depression justified her affairs, my doubt dissolved. In that moment, I realized that sparing her wouldn't spare me any pain. I had to walk away knowing I'd held her accountable. And so here I am, writing this in the quiet of my study. The air is cool, the leaves are gone from the trees, and winter is creeping in. I glance at the spot on my shelf where I keep a small memento, a keychain from our wedding day. I found it in a box of old stuff and didn't have the heart to throw it out. It's the only piece of our marriage I saved, not out of sentimentality, but as a reminder of how much can change and how vital it is to protect one's sense of self. If you're wondering whether I'm bitter, I'd say not anymore. Anger was the fuel that got me through one of the darkest chapters of my life, but it slowly burned out, leaving room for a more grounded perspective. I'm grateful I defended myself when I was vulnerable, grateful I pursued a fair, or perhaps ruthless settlement, and grateful I didn't let her excuses sway me into thinking I was the reason for her betrayal. Because that's the crucial point. No one else is responsible for our choices. She made hers, and I made mine in response. Sometimes I think about how depression can warp your view of yourself and the world. It can make you cling to the hope that people will show you kindness in your darkest hour. But it can also sharpen your instincts when that kindness isn't there. If I hadn't been so low, maybe I would have confronted her sooner, or maybe I would have walked away before marriage even came into the picture. It doesn't matter now. All I know is that pain can be transformative, and though I wouldn't wish this experience on anyone, I can't deny it forced me to grow. I don't know what Anna's life looks like now. The last I heard, she was renting a small apartment and trying to find stable work. I hope she's taking her therapy seriously for her sake, but also to ensure she doesn't destroy someone else's life down the road. As for me, I've entertained the idea of dating again, though I move cautiously, aware that trust is not something I hand out freely anymore. I still have nightmares occasionally, but fewer than before. Most mornings, I wake up ready to face the day, feeling like maybe there's a future out there that doesn't revolve around betrayal or revenge. People often say that the best revenge is living well. I used to think that was just a cliche, but I've come to see the wisdom in it. Ensuring Anna walked away with nothing gave me a sense of immediate justice, but the real prize is the life I'm building in the aftermath. Every laugh with friends, every new achievement at work, every hobby I explore, those are the things that truly leave the bitterness behind. She can't touch that part of me anymore. She never will. And that, ultimately, is what keeps me going. I've reclaimed my life, shaped it in a way that honors my value, and learned that sometimes not forgiving is perfectly acceptable if it helps you heal. If Anna taught me anything, it's that there's a line no one should ever cross: using another person's pain as an excuse for your own betrayal. She crossed that line, and I have zero regrets about ensuring she paid the price. Though you never truly erase a painful past, you can transform it into fuel for a better tomorrow. And that's exactly what I did. I found a reason to keep going, despite it all. And in the quiet moments when I close my eyes, I tell myself the truth. I deserved more than she was willing to give, and it took her darkest betrayal for me to finally see my own worth. Now, when I look in the mirror, I see someone who fought for himself when it mattered most, and who won